So my name is Yukari Yamashita. Maybe some of you know that I'm your president-elect, president-to-be for the next year of the Iaee. I am from the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, and I am your last moderator of the last session of the last day. So we are all the last. So, so thank you all for staying for the last session of the last day. Special thanks actually goes to Christian von Hirschhausen, sitting here. He actually took over the first topic from the Pantelis Kapros, which is about the energy scenario projections and modeling. And we actually heard that Christian and his colleagues were working on it during the gala dinner last night. Thank you very much for Christian. Thank you very much, Christian. So now for the closing session, please sit down, please. Please do come in quickly, then settle down. So now, for the closing plenary, we have 3 excellent speakers. And they will cover 3 topics: scenarios and modeling, energy policy suggestion for the EC, and Southeast European energy challenges. I would like to ask the 3 speakers to speak one after another, and to take the questions and then comments and then answers at the very end of this session. So they will speak, each one of them will speak at 20 minutes or so. So we will have a little bit of time left at the end. So hopefully you will all listen to it very carefully and then have very challenging questions at the end. So without waiting for the too much, I would like to introduce Christian von Hirschhausen to talk about energy scenario projections and modeling. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Yukari, for the introduction. Actually, it was after the dinner that we started to work. And it's my pleasure to present some work which actually is related to what Pantelis Kapros might have presented. And it so happens that I abused this occasion for advertising a recent book that we made on the Energiewende in Germany in the European context. It's small, but you can read it here. This is the so-called clean energy package calculated by Pantelis and his group. And this is the topic I'm most interested in. That's the Calder Hall nuclear power plant. And I tried to get this together in about 15 minutes. Now the title is Energy Scenarios, Projections and Modeling Academic Approach. I take from academic approach that I can say anything I want. Otherwise, it's difficult to interpret it. But so actually, it was, we put together chapter 13 from this book on the energy transformation and added a couple of things. Thanks very much to Chris and Ben and others for help in this. It is also the topic of the next EAP scenario, so of the next EAP symposium on energy and climate scenarios. So actually, this is also the introduction that we're currently writing. I will then focus on the role of scenarios and modeling in the policy process, and we had a brilliant policy session yesterday morning with Alberto and Mr. Schmidt from NSOE, and we had the governance issues and the role of policy in this decarbonization process. And then I will take as example the so-called clean energy package representing Pantelis' work and then conclude. Now, scenarios and foresight and forecasts are a fun thing to do, in particular if you have the pleasure of not having to do the modeling, which is my pleasure. I used to do it more intensively. I don't do it as intensive any longer, but I enjoy very much. So this is pieced together from work by for the EAP issue. We need to distinguish between forecasting, foresight and scenario forecasting is trying to understand what's going to happen, what's the energy demand in Bangladesh in 2030. Foresight is a more general process of providing guidance to decision making, and then scenario development is a process. It's a fun process that we even hired an expert to teach us how to do this in a European project which was called SETNAV. And we spent a couple of days actually together, and it was quite useful because it brings together the competences from modelers with other social sciences, with other sciences, social sciences, natural sciences, etc. It's a political process because everything is political, and it brings about guidance for the policy-making process, in that case, for the European clean energy package. So it's complicated, but it's fun, and so actually between DIW and TU Berlin, we now institutionalize this and do this every year, the way other teams are doing this, for example, at MIT for a long time. Now, you need to make choices, right? All of you who do this work know you can't just go ahead and just work, but you need to make choices, for example, on the models you're using. If you have several models available, you need to decide what do they cover. For example, is it Cournot, is it perfect competition? What are the trade restrictions, in particular in integrated assessment models? Trade plays, of course, a very important role. Sector linkage, we had this discussion here and we'll have it at other places. Do I focus on electricity or do I take into account other sectors, agriculture, transportation, etc.? And then, of course, the objective function. We like to optimize social welfare, but then there are others that say this does not correspond to reality, so let's simulate something. And I picked up this graph here from 2005 that when we engaged into electricity modeling, it shows you how complex it is, and it's become more complex as we go on. Now you need to make policy choices on what you're studying. Are you studying one country, for example, the US, NOPR 2 years ago? Are you studying a couple of countries, like the OPEC countries on fuel subsidies? Are you focusing on a region or a cross-country? There's currently the EMF 34 going on energy trading in North America, but you have these seams issues between Mexico and the United States, between the United States and Canada. Or are you looking at the global issue? When you do global, things are quite easy, but then when you translate this into a national one, things become complicated. For example, what's the social cost of carbon in Nigeria? That's a question we're currently debating in a case study on solar home systems in Nigeria. Should we take the German value, which is 180 euros? Should we take the US value, which is $40? Should we take, what are we supposed to take? So these choices have to be made ex ante, and of course they have an impact on the results. Now, as an industrial engineer, I love technology, but nothing's more difficult to predict than technology. As a matter of fact, recently I learned that coal, which I would have thought was the cheapest technology of all, was subsidized in the beginnings because it was people used wood, of course. In order to get people away from wood, coal was subsidized. Please use coal and stop deforestation. That must have been in the 16th century, I guess. Natural gas, the gas turbine was developed around the turn of the century. Nuclear power came about in 45. So these technologies kind of don't come through markets by themselves, but they come in elements, and some are good and some are less efficient. I've been waiting since volume 1.2, which was in 2012, on carbon capture, transport, and sequestration, which everybody loves to talk about, but nobody's doing for the last 15 years. Storage technology, so we need to take into account assumptions on technologies, but we shouldn't overestimate this, because there are other things that are even more important or as important. for example, demand side and market interaction, and these are much less easy to model, so these come less into the modeling sphere than they should. Another advertisement for EAP with an increasing impact factor, and the next number where we try to bring these questions together. Sergei Paltsev is on the board, Chandra Bhushan from India, Klaus Mohn on Iaee's World Energy Outlook, and then some results from the SETNAV project. Okay, what role do scenarios play in the policy process? Usually in the Economics 101 that I teach, I used to tell the students, there's a policy process and we just provide information and then let the policymakers go. Since sometime I don't teach this anymore because it's not true. We are part of this policy process, and there's this brilliant paper by Ottmar Edenhofer and Martin Korvasch that is analyzing this in a quite detailed manner. So they distinguish three modes of policy advice. One is the decisionist model, going back to Thomas Hobbes and Max Weber, where this distinction is made. You have the policy process that asks you as a consultant, please provide me some modeling results. And so the economists or the engineers are social engineers, and then they give pieces of information to the policy process, which is one model that I don't think is very realistic, but it's one of the models. The second one is the technocratic model that many engineers like, because the engineers define the ends. Then the engineers give and the economists, of course, the scientists, they give the means, the instruments, CO2 price, whatever, and then they hand it on to the policymakers. Ottmar suggests to take a more pragmatic approach in the realm of the critical philosophical school, where actually, first of all, we have a circle of decision-making processes. So these go kind of round and round. There's a public debate that decides the problem and the end-means relation. Here's the scientists that intervene, and Ottmar calls them the map makers. They do options, scenarios, etc. This goes into the policy process, that is the parliament and legislation, etc. But it comes back. It comes back because it's evaluated and goes back into the public debate, so there's a permanent circle, and doing this kind of work makes you realize you're part of the circle, some epsilon in this. And there's, we're part of this process to the extent that this is not a separate sharing of work, but the work kind of goes hand in hand, and I refer you to a paper by Atle Midthun and Baumgarten in 1986, which they call Negotiating Energy Futures. And at the time, they were asking why had nuclear power been so successful in the energy modeling, nuclear fusion, in particular in the 60s and 70s. And they put up this model that they call the triangle, where there's the academics, teaching, here's data collection, the statistics, etc., and here's the policy makers and the bureaucrats, and they kind of interact and thus come up with something which is more or less along the same lines. And in order to deviate, you need some impetus and innovation to come about. Now let's come from history to the current times of Europe, because the session is on Europe. I take the clean energy package. I put the clean in brackets because I don't consider coal to be clean, but there's coal in this package. I don't consider nuclear power to be clean. Nuclear power is quite dangerous, as a matter of fact. So I think we should talk about a decarbonized energy package. And here comes an interpretation of how different assumptions go into different results that go into different policy conclusions. So I compare the clean energy package, this one, with work that's currently going on in the coal exit group. and to highlight the importance of assumptions, not to say one is true and one is not true, but to say be careful in assumptions, modeling work, be transparent. We want to see the data, we want to see the code, and then we can have this debate and turn in circles and be friends nonetheless. I focus on nuclear because I understand a little bit about this now. I could focus on other technologies. Chris, who was in the room last night, probably too long, focusing on carbon dioxide removal technologies, and there are other people working on other technologies. You see, and this I think is important in the clean energy package, that this is a scenario work. What's going on here, and this is focused on electricity, is that there's a baseline, a kind of business as usual. Then you got energy efficiency scenario. You got a circular economy scenario. You got one on where there's a lot of electrification, so you see that electricity demand is going up, even though energy demand may be constant. You got a hydrogen scenario, which was talked about a lot yesterday. You had a power to X. You had a combo. Combo means a combination of the best technology. So electricity demand is going down. Power to X. I mentioned it. So these are the 2-degree scenarios. And then there are two 1.5-degree scenarios. One focusing on the supply side and the other one on the demand side. And this is a new development. I think it's an important development because traditionally, I think we focus too much on supply. There are some people in this room that work on demand and energy efficiency for their whole lives, but overall, I think the modeling scene is focusing on technology supply. And lifestyle is a new term that didn't appear until recently. It's about behavior. In our group, we call it singing and dancing because it has a different flavor to it than the traditional models, and it's difficult to put this into an integrated assessment model, but that's what we have to work on. I oppose this to work of our singing and dancing group, which has the same objective function, which is a far-reaching decarbonization of the electricity sector. So this is electricity only, but where there are different assumptions on costs and on the availability. And let's focus, because time is limited, let's focus on the share of nuclear in here. And whereas in the European scenarios, it's constant. It's like always the same. Here it's kind of going down because economically this is an optimization, it's cost minimization. It's just not economic. So what you find in the national electricity mixes is an optimization at the European level, which is different from what Pantelis does. He has national projects, and so actually in the primes, the national capacities, and these are capacities here, are added up to make the European ones, which makes a big difference because you can have different assumptions on national capacities, whereas this is an overall optimization. Okay. Why do I think that the term clean energy package is not the right title? Because it's not clean. It contains nuclear power, and I had this discussion before. I'm German, I know, but my father was a hardcore nuclear fan, and we were brought up to be nuclear fans as well. So, but here's also a lot of fossil fuels, CCS, and there's bio-CCS. Now, CCS has been talked about for a long time, and it's not really. There are pilot projects. There's the DRAX pilot project on bio carbon capture and sequestration, but it's not really going forward. The hydrogen that Australia is exporting to Japan is not clean hydrogen, it's fossil hydrogen, right? So when we come to Tokyo, it might have changed in 21, but currently it's mainly based on dirty coal. So the difference in the models, one, if you assume the true cost of nuclear, then in the European scenario, the plants running out, you can of course assume new builds, which we do here, for example, for the UK and France. So there will be still, according to this, nuclear in the European energy mix in 2050, but it's going back, whereas in the clean energy package, and this is 2016, but it's the same, more or less the same in 2018, you have both new builds and you have lifetime extensions of a significant amount. So different assumptions give different results. Now, since my time is almost over, I will not go into the historic part here, but I refer you to it because there's this book by François Levesque, whom I'm very thankful for because he helped me understand the nuclear power paradox in explaining why nuclear is still around, and that doesn't have to do with economics, but it's a child of science and warfare, and there's nothing more impressive than to fuel entire Slovenia with a cube of uranium. That's fascinating, but it's not economic. And I'll spare you the history. Interestingly, nobody has ever said that nuclear was economic. I did a search of about 500 papers, Paul Josko, MIT, Parsons Josko, William Daisler, and recently Lucas Davis from Berkeley said 70 years after 45, the industry is still trying to demonstrate how this can be scaled up cheaply enough to compete with coal and natural gas, and I refer you to this paper if you want also our own modeling on this. Nuclear, given the assumptions that we do, which are plausible, is not economic, which does not mean that countries are not investing into nuclear power. This is a paper I presented yesterday, which shows that there's, in this case, 24 so-called newbies, which may be entering into nuclear power: Bolivia, Algeria, Sudan, Laos, Belarus, and you get a flavor. And fortunately, we have a good econometrician who shows in this paper that the hypothesis that the probability of a country entering into nuclear is inversely related to the level of democratic institutions. So it's this, this graph here. This is not a detailed presentation, but I think it's interesting because democratic countries have almost zero probability of entering into nuclear because it's not economic. So you would have refusal, etc. And as countries become less democratic, it becomes easier to push this through, is what this data says. And we'll have this discussion later on. I think it's an interesting case, and it's a little bit, I'm sorry to mention this, nuclear is a little bit like pornography. Many people think about it, but nobody dares to talk about it. At this conference, there was one session because there were no submissions, so it's become out of fashion. But I think it's interesting. So let me conclude. Climate and energy scenarios are a controversial topic. We are focusing too much on technologies, and I just picked one. I might have picked renewables. Renewables may be cleaner, but they also use resources, and so the demand side should be taken more into account, both with respect to the modeling itself and with respect to the behavioral assumptions. And then I think we've gone very far in increasing transparency, open data, open court to make these things evident. It would have been impossible to do this paper 20 years ago because you wouldn't have the data, you wouldn't have the access. And even though this has been dealt a lot with, we still got lots of things to do, so I look forward to the discussion, and I thank you very much for the attention.
Speech. I must defend Japan somewhere, but only one I mentioned that the hydrogen from Australia, you said it's not clean, but we Japan are asking Australia to do the CCS on the site. So that by the time the hydrogen comes to Japan, it's clean. Okay, so next speaker is Mikhail Polit. And then his title is What Next for European Energy Policy. He's from the Cambridge Judge Business School. Okay, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for staying, and thank you to Nevenka and her team for organizing a wonderful conference. Christian, you should read our paper, which is on EPRG's website on financing low-carbon investment, where we talk about how to finance new nuclear cheaply in the UK. Anyway, we can talk about that in the discussion. I am hesitating to comment on European energy policy, just as the UK is about to leave the European Union. But I claim an affiliation with the Centre for Regulation in Europe, CER, and this work that I'm going to talk about is part of a white paper that my colleagues at CER, who are a group of academics interested in energy. We've also got people interested in telecoms and in transport. My colleagues at CER and I have been thinking about this question of what we would say to the new Commission about how they can advance European energy policy, even beyond the dizzy heights of the winter package from November 2016. I have to tell you, I was at a meeting with the Commission, and you can imagine we were sitting around, and the Commission have already published 800 pages of what should happen. And somebody very frustratedly said, "What, are you telling us there's still more that we can do?" And I said, it would be very surprising to an academic if you had perfectly implemented the perfect European energy policy, even after 4 packages. So, you know, there's still more to do, isn't there? What I want to do is I'll say a little bit about where we've got to with European energy policy, and I mean electricity and gas, and then I'll say a little bit about some of our recommendations for things to focus on in the next 5 years of the Commission. Okay, so yeah, we've heard a lot about this already. There's been 4 packages of reform. Important to say the first 3 were about electricity and gas. The actual 4th package is only about electricity, and there is supposedly a gas package coming along sometime soon. We do have these 2030 targets, which, as we've already heard from many other people, are particularly ambitious, and will, you know, however well we're doing up to 2020, it's going to be even tougher to meet the targets going forward. There are some interesting proposals, again, which are in the 4th package, which are new developments, an increased focus on the distribution level and sort of decentralized energy, and you know, this putting consumers at the heart of energy. Okay. Now, everybody who is an expert would worry about putting consumers at the heart of energy. Okay, because that sounds like, you know, giving control away to people who won't necessarily make the right decisions. So everybody who keeps saying, oh, democratization of energy sounds like a good idea. How do you know people will vote the right way? Okay, they might vote against energy and climate policy. No, not that that's a bad thing, but it is, be careful what you wish for. So I'll say a little bit about progress, and then I've got these, we've got in our white paper, which we're going to publish formally in Brussels in September, which I'm giving you a sort of heads up of. We talk about future developments in markets, we talk about some of the infrastructure issues for electricity and gas infrastructure, and we talk about some of the potential institutional reforms, even beyond what has already been done. These aren't just my ideas. My many colleagues at SARE have contributed to them. Okay, what about the progress we've made on the single energy market in Europe? Now, one of the interesting things to me, and here's a sort of challenge to everybody, is it would be interesting to see more analysis of the past and less future scenarios, because all future scenarios are wrong. They may be brilliant, they may be internally consistent, but they're wrong, okay, except by accident. You know, yes, somebody is going to get the scenario right out of the many thousands of scenarios that we see. What we need more of is analysis of how well it's gone so far, what we can learn from past history. And surprisingly, the analysis that the Commission itself has commissioned on the past is really bad. It's mostly, it's back of the envelope calculations, and I should say some of it, the most recent report, actually is done by some of my colleagues at Cambridge. Brilliant though David Newbury is, it is still a back of the envelope calculation. And, you know, you can see that the gains are, you know, okay. I mean, 2.5 billion a year from completing the single electricity market day ahead. You know, it's worth having, but it's pretty small. You know, it's maybe 2% of wholesale energy costs, maybe. Gas actually depends how you calculate it. We heard, I mean, Alberta, when he was speaking in the first session, said, oh, it's 400 million. And that sounds a bit low. David's back of the envelope calculation is a lot higher than that, partly because if the border prices for gas are harmonized downwards, of course, all internal prices for gas fall. Of course, if that happens, in a way that it doesn't really happen for electricity because the border prices don't determine the internal price, you can get much higher gains from the completion of the internal gas market, which, you know, it would be nice to see some decent analysis on how big the internal market in gas gains have been. You know, so how can we assess the single energy market? You know, if we use conventional OECD measures of institutional reform, yes, there has been some improvement. You know, these measures run from 6 to 0, 0 being the most liberalized the sector can be. And yes, Europe has improved its product market regulation score in both electricity and gas, but, you know, not hugely, and there's still a long way to go. I mean, the UK's at 0 on these. So, you know, everybody else has room for improvement. The quality of sector regulation has also improved, but, you know, it's been a long time too. I mean, it's sort of 25 years of reform. We'd expect regulation to have improved a bit. If you look at conventional measures that are trying to pick up consumer and producer surplus changes, what's happened to prices, what's happened to costs, what's happened to rates of return, wholesale prices may have fallen a bit, but actual final prices for residential consumers probably haven't fallen much at all as a result of the single market. That's why people are annoyed with the single market, because it's not gaining for them. Some evidence that the merger gains and efficiency gains as a result of mergers. So yes, the producer side has been rationalized, and there are some gains from that. And, you know, some of the impacts on the poorest customers, still there is a lot of energy poverty in Europe, especially in Northern Europe. But perhaps it hasn't got worse as a result of the single market. Quality of service, so Acer and SARE have begun publishing better measures of quality of service across Europe, and there does seem to be some improvement. Customer minutes lost are falling for both electricity and gas, though what the counterfactual is another thing. You know, probably they would have fallen anyway. to what extent are they falling as a result of the pressure that the Commission is putting on regulators to improve, and as a result of general reform across Europe? That's not clear. The counterfactual is not well defined. There have been efforts to improve coordination across Europe with these TSO coordination groups, of which CAREZO is the biggest. So this is system operators getting together in order to better coordinate cross-border, cross-system flows. This is, of course, more necessary in a European energy system with more transfers of electricity between different systems. There has been a big environmental improvement, that's true, on all measures of the environment. The system has got less impactful. Pushing that to the next level of the targets will get increasingly difficult, but there has clearly been a lot of progress, particularly as a result of switching from coal to gas and upping the share of renewables. That is beginning to have a big impact at the European level, with larger impacts within individual countries. People often ask me whether more liberalized markets promote better environmental outcomes. The evidence does seem to be yes. Countries that have got tougher targets do seem to, countries that have got more liberalized energy systems also have less environmental impact, partly because perhaps some of the gains from the increased market efficiency are then spent on more subsidy or more environmental improvement. Okay. What's been the impact on innovation? Was that a session where we're talking about innovation? That's more difficult. So, this has been going on for a long time. The evidence seems to be that R&D has declined, certainly by the big utilities in electricity and gas. And it's not clear that productivity growth is that high in energy across Europe. So it's, we do need more investment, as we were hearing in some of the earlier sessions, particularly in some of the areas where future environmental improvement will be required inside heating systems and perhaps if we switch to hydrogen networks. And of course, what the impact of declining R&D within energy is on the whole economy is nobody seems to have worked on that, and it would be interesting to see some work on that. So overall, there's lots of activity, there's lots of impressive structural change, lots of market extension has gone on, but lots of ownership change and the emergence of pan-European energy companies. But the actual overall evidence is pretty limited on how big the effects are, partly because it's econometrically difficult. Everything is changing all the time, and good luck to everybody who wants to continue researching on European energy policy when you go from EU 28 to EU 27. Politicians aren't making it easy for statistical analysis over time. So the proven gains from the single market are pretty small. They are mostly in the air, they are maybe worth having, but the distributional effects, of course, could well outweigh some of the overall efficiency effects. Yeah, the gains are pretty ambiguous, and the Commission itself hasn't done very good analysis on the effects of the single market, partly because, of course, the Commission is schizophrenic about it. The Commission wants to keep pushing on the extension of the single market and the completion of the single market, and it doesn't want to put out research which says, oh, we've done a great job so far, we can stop now. But on the other hand, it probably should do some analysis to work out how it's doing, and analysis is a lot more careful than the stuff it has published. Okay, so is the single market complete? And Alberto talked about this. The answer is clearly no. Okay, it's not complete, particularly on intraday trading for electricity and on balancing actions, even though there's a lot of progress on day-ahead market coupling. It's not complete in gas market. Yes, there's been a lot of progress on price convergence and gas flowing in the right direction on the major hubs, but on the European periphery, there is still a lot of work to do in completing the internal market in gas. So the market is clearly not complete. Progress is being made on targets, and we've heard about this. Yeah, we're going to meet the 2020 renewables target probably. We've already met the greenhouse gas target, but we're probably going to miss the energy efficiency target because it's currently going in the wrong direction and is not going to make it back by 2020 unless we have a major recession, which we don't want. So what about here are some suggestions of what the Commission should work on. Carbon pricing. The European carbon market is needs to be extended, it needs to be tightened, it has to be the basis of all sensible decarbonisation. Electricity market design is in flux. We need to redesign our electricity market for very high percentages of renewables. That it's not clear how best to do that. It could mean massive reintegration of parts of the energy system, not the current system, which is designed for fossil fuels of vertical separation. Gas is a big issue. I mean, are we going to shut down the gas network across Europe, or are we going to repurpose it for hydrogen or syngas? That should be something that occupies the Commission. So there's still lots that can be done on markets over the next 5 years to get ready for the deep decarbonisation that we are looking at. On infrastructure for the network infrastructure is going to be increasingly important in total costs as demand falls. And people adding costs to the network by just building a bit of network, which we don't really need, that's going to, that's a fixed cost which we need to work out how to pay for. So controlling overall network costs is going to be much more important in the future than it has been in the past. How those costs are apportioned out to individual customers, we were having some nice papers about, how you could make money in Germany from being a prosumer. Yeah, you can arbitrage the existing network charges, but that's not good for actually financing the network. So how networks are paid for is going to be really important in the future. And where do you draw the boundary between a DSO and a TSO? We've got a nice paper which shows the voltage levels are different in virtually every country. But surely the Commission might have a view on this voltage level and below is distribution, this voltage level and above is transmission, and there should be competitive procurement above this voltage level. Rather than this arbitrary patchwork of voltage levels that we have at the moment, which can be anti-competitive at a European level. And then finally, what's some of our governance things that you might want to think about? Are the current governance structures that we've got, we're now moving to a world where a single market is going to become even more valuable than it was in the past because of the intermittency of renewables. Therefore, we need institutional arrangements which truly reflect pan-European issues. We know we need to move away from national system operators and have much more beefed up international coordination of cross-border flows, or much more joined up national institutions. We might need more rules on a transfer of data between systems, and again, people using data laws anti-competitively around energy. Regulation, there's still a wide degree of, Ofgem, I know, in Britain, really struggling to know what to do about the energy transition, and they are a really competent regulator, relatively speaking. So what do you think some smaller regulators on the European periphery are doing? I mean, there's clearly a role for European institutions to support national regulators and give them much clearer actual help in how you manage the energy transition. And we want to encourage pan-European competition around flexibility and aggregation. In the end, yeah, we're in the sort of internet bubble of energy startups. Eventually, we'll get big platforms emerging in flexibility, hopefully, and they need to be pan-European. There shouldn't be rules restricting people being able to aggregate loads across Europe and sell it across Europe. So this is my last slide, some big themes that I think the Commission should think about. Carbon and heating markets need to be worked on. And it's not just about electricity and gas. If we're going to meet our climate targets, very high percentage of renewables at the European level do mean changing the nature of institutions and the way markets operate from the way they've operated with fossil fuel-based national markets. We need to be much more careful about handling network fixed costs. I think increasingly people are going to focus on who pays for the energy transition. We've got to stop talking about the energy transition as an opportunity for rich consumers. The issue is, how do we protect poor consumers from ending up paying the cost of the energy transition, because that's the surest way to derail it at the European level. And in terms of thinking about, where the Commission needs to put its effort, it needs to think much more strongly about completing the market on the periphery. The single gas market needs to be completed for the benefit of the periphery. The big central countries in Europe, they're going to be fine, okay? It's the peripheral countries that you need to worry about, and where the biggest proportional gains are from completing the single market. Thank you very much.
It seems that lots of work to do is not only for modeling community, but also for the European Commission. So next, I would like to invite the Atanas Georgiev from the Sofia University, and his topic today is Southeast European energy challenges and opportunities. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I guess the applause is to suggest for me to be shorter, being the last plenary speaker of the day. Yeah. Thank you very much for presenting me, and I would like to first express my gratitude to the organizing team of the conference, being at the end of it, for such a great experience. I'm going to talk about two issues. The challenges, of course, so on European level it will be quite similar to what Pantelis and Michael said. And then presenting some results from a case study that my colleagues from the Center of the Study of Democracy and I did on small-scale renewables in Bulgaria. So starting ahead, it has already been discussed. There are many challenges on the global level, of course, the climate pledges and some, let's say, cancellations or steps back. In the European Union now, the most important step for the next 10 years is the integrated national energy and climate plans. They have been discussed during these days, but just to put it in another way, we still don't see enough individual effort in order to meet the general goal which has been set at the Union level. In terms of local challenges, we have some additional ones, especially for the region of Southeast Europe. We'll be looking at the data in a more detailed way. We have both EU members and energy community or non-EU members in the region, but still there are some issues related to the share of lignite power. Here, There is the case of the security of gas supply. We have been listening a lot about the future of gas, but what future if there is no gas or the security is low? We have been talking a lot about the renewables and the subsidies, the support schemes. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that some of the countries with the lowest income in Europe are exactly in Southeast Europe, and a bunch of them together, so a concentrated number of countries. The goals have been discussed. I'm not going to discuss much about the clean energy package. Just when you look at the zoomed-in data that we will be looking at in a minute or two, we'll see that actually the completion of these goals has to be examined in a deeper way, because this share of renewables, it includes not only the electricity production, but also other parts of the energy balance. And from what I see, we don't discuss enough all the aspects of renewable energy production, especially in the heating and transportation sector. Getting back to the regional perspectives, some of the highest inefficiencies in energy consumption in this region are related to transportation, to heating, insulation of buildings. So especially here, we have to be careful about that. So there is a large set of legislation. Again, this has been mentioned before. I'm just going to project this to the non-EU members of the region. You can see here the so-called energy community, which is known, it's an international agreement between the European Union and countries in this region, Southeast Europe. So the countries in yellow, we may say that they are quasi-European Union members in terms of energy markets. So all the energy policies that we are discussing on EU level, they affect these countries too, especially in the electricity, gas, and carbon emissions sectors. So this is also, again, important because being inside the EU and having these goals and fulfilling them brings one kind of benefit or reward, but expecting a future reward 15 or 20 years ahead in time, as the perspective, the current perspective for the Western Balkans to join the EU is, maybe a bit not so reassuring. I will quote here, without saying the name of the country, but one of my colleagues at the university in one of these countries was giving me the example why they are building new thermal power plants, just starting now, and comparing the current benefits of having cheaper, local, secure electricity supply with the future benefits of joining the European Union, maybe at some point in time. So this is also affecting the energy policy, the current energy decisions in the region, and has to be taken into account. Sankey diagrams have been mentioned. Yes, they don't tell the whole story, of course, but still I wanted to compare first on this slide. It is the general EU 28 energy balance. Just several things here to be mentioned. The largest stream, of course, is the imported energy. Some of the imported energy, oil, is exported, re-exported as oil products. But still you see the dependence, the net import dependence. Nuclear, again, considered local, but especially in Central and Southeastern Europe. Nuclear fuel is not coming from EU members, it's coming at most cases from Russia. So this has to be reconsidered in a way as a local resource. And also, please take note of the natural gas share. So in the European Union as a whole, the natural gas has a big share. And if we go now to the set of countries I have selected from our region, you see that the gas consumption, the yellow one, is smaller, considerably smaller. There is a bigger share of solid fuels, so local lignite coming from local mines. The share of nuclear is smaller. It's present, but only in several countries. So, for example, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia and Slovenia with the power plant. And again, the case with nuclear fuel. So what are these countries going to do in order to adjust these energy balances to the new goals, especially to 2030? And how much is this going to cost? And how the grids will be developed? We have been talking a lot about gas and electricity here because this is in the, let's say, the internal energy market agenda. But again, there are more issues in energy economics than electricity and gas markets alone. So the coupling of the electricity and gas markets usually takes the stage, and the rest of the issues remain a bit forgotten. So how does a picture, this is a picture from the weekend by Electricity Map Live, showing first the production and then the consumption of electricity. So if we look at the production, we see some green countries, but this is green electricity production, meaning low carbon, meaning renewables, hydro and nuclear. When we look at our region, it's quite brown. Maybe the Poland is another one which is sticking out, but the region of Southeast Europe quite brown. Even in terms of consumption, the region is generally a net importer of electricity. So when we look at the energy balances and dig further, we see that this issue of diminishing the carbon emissions is going to be a tough one. The goals to 2020 and their fulfillment have been discussed a lot. Again, we have the general maybe fulfillment of the goal until next year. I just want to attract your attention to some of the biggest consumers of energy in the European Union, like United Kingdom, yes, still in, Germany, or Belgium, or the Netherlands, who are still lagging behind in terms of the renewable energy share in the final energy consumption. So again, what are we doing for the next 10 years? How is this going to be achieved if this target for 2020 is taking so much time? These are some very interesting data on the energy balances related to the renewable energy fulfillment of the 2020 goal. From the European Environmental Agency, it's published in June this year, analyzing the shares of different types of energy in this general renewable energy goal. So you see in the bottom, the blue bars representing the electricity in the final energy mix, which comes from renewables. Then you see with red the heating and cooling. And then you have the transportation sector, and the transportation with having only compliant biofuels included with light green. So you can see that actually we are discussing a lot about wind and solar photovoltaic and biomass for electricity production, but actually we are fulfilling the European goal with other types of energy. When we zoom in further, and I call this do we know our S, so in absolute terms, heating and cooling remains the dominant market sector. This is the interesting one. Final energy consumption of solid biomass represented 83% of the total renewable energy sources of heating and cooling. And I'll tell you what solid biomass means in Bulgaria or other countries in the region. This is burning firewood into very primitive device. So this goes into the 2020 goal. And I open a bracket here, especially in the National Energy and Climate Plan, the draft one which was presented by the Bulgarian Ministry of Energy. This share is projected to grow because it's let's say, easier to achieve such a goal, which seems very carbon neutral, but has very significant local effects. So especially in the cold winter days in Sofia, yeah, the capital of Bulgaria, where we also have people heating themselves with wood, you can actually see what you're breathing. So at the EU level, renewables made up almost 1/5 of all gross final energy consumed for heating and cooling. The sector grew by 4% each year. The growth will be sustained. And in 16 member states of the European Union, the heating and cooling from renewables represents over half of the national gross final consumption of renewables. So you see here Bulgaria that was mentioned already, and some other countries from Central and Southeastern Europe. So since 2005, despite biogas and heat pumps having the fastest compound annual growth rates, solid biomass-based technologies prevailed in this market sector. What about electricity? Again, do we know what exactly is happening with the energy balance? So the data of the EEA show that hydropower was the greatest one, yes, of course, representing 36%. The share of hydropower in the renewables has dropped by half because of the development of new technologies. Wind accounts 32%. Solar energy with a fast growth since 2005. Solid biofuels again, so we have biofuels or biomass being used for electricity production, and all our renewables. So there is a large variation, of course, and again, it's a big question how the numbers that are on European level for 2030 will be projected for the period until 2030. Here are some data about the transportation sector as well. Biomass, again, related biofuels. I'm sorry that I'm going to present some data now which are separate for the EU members and the energy community, but actually since the moving of some members of the energy community like Bulgaria and Romania and Croatia to the European Union, the energy community makes this analysis for energy community members only. So I just want to give a very short overview of the energy mix. So this is just representing Bulgaria, Greece, Croatia, Romania, and Slovenia general energy mix, where we see that oil is taking, for example, big share in Greece, but we have a solid fuel share which is significant in the region. Gas, not so much. Renewables with a pretty nice share. Nuclear present only here and there, as was already mentioned. What is the situation in the other countries? As I mentioned, part of an analysis by the energy community. So the latest ones show quite a high share of usage of coal in the generation fuel mix. So this is for electricity only. And let me just add here that new projects are being developed in more than 2 or 3 countries of this group. There is another thing which also is prevalent in low-income markets. We still haven't eradicated all the subsidies. So here is an example, again by this analysis of the energy community, of coal-related subsidies. In Bulgaria, let's say, we don't have coal subsidies per se, but the way the regulated prices are formed and the prices of the biggest lignite local mine are defined, and this means defined by the Minister of Energy, has some comparison to this thing. So we are still in this age, let's say, where fossil fuels are heavily subsidized because of the general subsidizing of end-user prices related to energy poverty. I'm not going to stop here, but just show you the end-user prices for households, for electricity. So looking at the left corner, you'll find most of the countries in this region. So for example, Albania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Kosovo, Northern Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro, taking the top 10, or let's say lowest 10 energy prices for household consumers. This is also valid for non-household or industrial business consumers, which is directly related to competitiveness, of course. If you look at the energy news in Bulgaria in the past couple of months, the increased integration of the electricity market is making the big industry shiver because they see prices converging with the regional ones, prices of electricity. And they are competitive somewhat because they receive some subsidies through electricity prices as well. So this was the general picture. I hope it was not too much energy union skeptic. Now I will switch a bit to a specific case. So looking at this energy balance, looking at how things have developed, we have made several analyses with my colleagues from the Center of the Study of Democracy. So I'm at Sofia University. I don't work with them at their location. They're very active in terms of doing research on the renewables integration in small-scale renewables. Let me say here that most of the wind and solar in Bulgaria have been built as grid-scale capacities, so not so much as a distributed generation. And the study, which was published last year, it's linked so you can see it later, explores the potential and the obstacles before the decentralization of electricity supply. So we have analyzed the policy, the scenarios for the development of renewables in Bulgaria. In general, the country is overperforming on its 2020 targets because, again, biomass is a big part of it. But still, you see that there is a potential for renewables from electricity. So the light blue bars represent this potential share of renewables from electricity. There was a big project which was with the participation of part of the team for projecting the potential, CRMAP it's called, projecting the potential of renewables in Europe, including Bulgaria. So here is some picture of the types of installations that have been built. So in terms of wind, from the total capacity of 700 megawatts, about 568 are bigger ones, let's say over 3 megawatt of installed capacity. And from the 1.7 gigawatt capacity of PV solar, about 700 are large projects, 700 megawatts. And there is also the top 10 analysis. So let's say the top 10 wind parks, they are about half of the total installed wind generation. And for solar, it's about 1/8. Meanwhile, in Germany, we compared with the data from Germany, the top 10 photovoltaic solar capacities have a total capacity of only 2.5%. So we have a bigger level of decentralization of solar power production, and it goes mostly where consumers are, and consumers are building their own capacity, which is not the case in Bulgaria. There has been a steady growth and then a big boom in small capacities until 2012, when the levy for renewables had to grow too much, and this was unacceptable to end consumers. There were some protests. So eventually, after 2012, the larger RES capacities are not built anymore with a support scheme, because there is, let's say, a grid unavailability being reported. But however, we still have a support scheme for 30 kilowatt peak solar systems that can be installed on rooftops. The bad thing about this, and this is part of our analysis, how much does it take for a household, let's say, to install such a capacity? We analyzed the procedures related to the permitting process. So one of the key factors there is the DSO, and when the DSO is not very much into distributed generation and does not want this distributed generation, especially in underpopulated regions and areas, they are not very supportive. Then you have, of course, the municipal administration, which, let's say, is renewables neutral, but in general is not very fast in giving construction permits. And the process has two stages. So the first one presented here is if you want to build something for your own consumption. And the second one is if you want to also return some electricity to the grid. So the total time frame of business days, so not just days, but business days, is something like 6 months to do it for something smaller than 30 kilowatt peak capacity. So we have defined, and I'm concluding with this, the challenges as being mostly administrative, so the renewables connection procedures are not streamlined. Local municipalities and different DSOs may have different procedures, which makes it difficult to even support the investors with the information. Regulatory, because of the general price signals of consumers and prosumers. Why produce your own electricity when you have the lowest one in the European Union, and the government is doing everything it can to keep it twisted for the end users. The only existing incentives up to now have been for large-scale renewables. Actually, this overheating of the market, it also changed the general perception of renewables, but this is another topic. And the challenge, which is general, so it's not energy-related, poverty. So not only energy poverty, the poverty of the population is issue. And lack of proper financial instruments, so taking a loan to make such an investment for an individual or a household is not so easy. So these are the key findings. Investments in RES stopped. The development close to consumption has not taken off. The 2030 targets for 32% in the energy mix cannot be achieved with the current policies. The potential, the technical one is large, and here is this link to the CIRMAP project which analyzed this. The legal challenges still exist because the legislation does not distinguish much between grid scale and small scale renewables. So small scale renewables have the same administrative burdens. No special provisions for prosumers or energy cooperatives. This was confirmed by the State of the Energy Union prosumers report almost 2 years ago. And the economics of small renewables investment is not working because of the existing cross subsidies. Again, when there is poverty, it's not politically correct to increase the prices or just make the price convergence. So the needed actions, amending the legislation, creating one-stop shop for municipalities to deal with these projects, development of programs for subsidized construction of small renewables, new grid regulation model, because this is also a big topic. I think it was not discussed a lot here. What happens when we lose part of the load or consumers, and the regulatory model is based on consumption. So removing the cross subsidies and reconsidering the large projects, simplifying procedures, changing from electricity only to heating and cooling and transportation as well, non-discriminatory market participation, and de-risking the investment of private investors. This is it. I hope I was not too long. Thank you for your attention, and let's have the questions.